No. Continue.
We're underway.
Okay. Good morning, listeners, and welcome again to the 3 Feet Radio Show. Today we've decided to do something a little bit different. We're going to do a bit of a book review and talk to an academic who is involved in the writing of the book, which is all about the insights and revelations from some of the legends of New Zealand netball. And joining me in the studio this morning is Luke Herbert. G'day, Luke.
G'day, Ben. And we've tossed around in discussions over the last 10 years the lack of netball books that are around, and our discussions weren't particularly fruitful for reasons we don't need to go into today and too long ago, but this certainly seems to cover that vacancy, our topic today, Ben.
It most certainly does. And joining us from Charles Sturt University is Dr. Lana McCarthy, who is one of the co-authors of Will to Win, New Zealand Netball Greats on Team Culture and Leadership. Good morning, Lana.
Good morning.
Would you like to get things going, Luke, and ask Lana the first one?
Yeah, just introduce yourself and your background to the listener, if you would.
Okay, yes, so my name is Dr. Lana McCarthy. I'm originally from New Zealand, largely based in Palmerston North. I am one of the co-authors of the book Will to Win, and currently I am based in Bathurst in New South Wales and working at CSU as a lecturer in physical education.
Ben, you're muted, Ben.
Yeah.
It happens to us all.
There we go.
There we go.
First of all, Lana, what was the inspiration for you to write both your doctoral thesis and subsequently the book you have, Will to Win? You seem to have a big emphasis on netball with all of your research.
Yeah, look, netball has always been such a big part of my life ever since I was a little tacker growing up. So really the reason behind the PhD was I was approached by the Northern Mystics ANZ franchise team back in 2014, and they were having issues around their team culture, and they were realizing, something's wrong. So they actually approached me to do some work with them and some study with them. So I completed a master's thesis looking into their team culture and leadership, and from there I just really learnt the importance, and I sort of grew a bit of a passion for what team culture is and leadership and coaching, and how this can impact the success on team sports. So once I completed that, I was kind of thinking, okay, well, I've done that, and I did that with a franchise team. I wonder if team culture and leadership and coaching styles actually change or differ within a national team. And obviously, still with netball being my passion and my background, I decided to do it with the Silver Ferns. So that was sort of the reason behind the PhD. And then when we were working through the PhD, we were gathering just such amazing insights and stories and information, and we were just, amazed by all of this. And something that really came to light for me was the lack of research that had been completed within high performance female sports teams, not just particularly netball, but right across all sports teams. So we thought, hang on, we've got something really special here. Let's make it into a book. And so just went from there.
Well, I'm for one very pleased you've turned this into a book. And just before I get to my main point, how do people order the book? It's better not miss the obvious.
How do people order the book? Right, it's actually available in Paper Plus and Wickles, and then you can actually order it online through the Massey Press website as well.
And just as a follow-up to the points you were making, but what role does sponsorship and media coverage contribute to team culture in netball?
Yeah, look, I mean, the media and sponsorship play a huge part, obviously. We've found that over the years it's definitely increased. It can be positive or negative. The positive, it can be great for the promotion of the sport, of for player revenue, increase of fans, increase of participation. But then, there's always sort of the negative side, I guess, of so much promotion on social media. the players have found that they're not just a silver fern when they're on the court now, they're a silver fern 24/7. So they're often in the spotlight. So yeah, it goes both ways.
All right.
And you talk about this.
No.
And you talk about the sorry, Luke, and you talk about the social media, Dr. Lana. One thing that Luke and I have discussed off air many times, we've discussed is how players get trolled and stuff like that, or they cop negative abuse and stuff like that. How much of an issue do you think that is within netball? Because I know in my years of covering it, I've been involved on and off for nearly 15 years now, and I've spoken to players personally, and they've said, yeah, I can't handle it, and some players can handle it. Has your research suggested that some can handle it and some can't handle it? And when you're playing for the Silver Ferns, you look at the Commonwealth Games debacle a couple of years ago, the Silver Ferns got off I think they got off Twitter purely because of that.
Yeah, exactly right. Like I said before, the media, it can be quite rough. I mean, they're a high performance sport. They're expected to perform. They're expected to win. And if they don't, the media can have a little bit of a field day. And so they are getting media training now. So they have to learn how to be able to cope with the pressures of the media, how to give interviews, and that sort of thing. But it's all part of being a high performance athlete now. As the games evolve, they're getting much more television coverage. They're expected to have to deal with pressures of the media. In the research, it didn't really come out as such as in terms of they were having to deal with a lot of negative stuff. One story from Casey Korpua, who did actually say that, she got caught out at a family barbecue, a beer in one hand, one beer, just with friends. She got caught in a photo, and then it went around that she was intoxicated at a barbecue. And so she's just more aware of things like you just have to be careful in the situations where you put yourself in, if there is, cameras around and that sort of thing, a bit more aware of what you post. So you do have to be a little bit more careful.
And just sort of following on from that topic in terms of not so much being careful, but mindset, from your own research and in the book, what can you take away from what's happened with sports psychology in the last 2 decades?
Yeah, look, it's definitely evolved. It's become such a crucial part of high performance sport, not just obviously within netball, but in all high performance sports. As part of being a high performance athlete, you have to deal with those pressures of winning and of losing. So sports psychology does really come into play with it. You have to learn how to deal with those pressures. But part of creating that real positive team culture, and what was evident within the Ferns, was that you win as a team and you lose as a team. So, no matter what they go through together, they deal with it together. So the sports psychology thing, a massive factor. And as the game is changing as well, all these specialist sort of areas such as sports psychology has come into play and is playing such a crucial part.
Just changing gears a bit here, Dr. Lana, who was the most interesting and engaging interview subject?
Oh, well, for me, having always been such a massive netball fan, getting to interview all of these legends was just probably one of the highlights of my life. They were just, all of them were just so supportive and so encouraging, and just they were loving this research being done because it hadn't been done before. But if I had to pick, which is really, really hard, there's two that really stood out for me. The first one was Dame Lois Muir, particularly because she is the queen of netball. And for me, I grew up watching and playing netball throughout the 90s, and so interviewing her, I learned so much more about sort of the early eras of netball and the history, what it was like for them when they're very first starting off and how hard it was. So that was really, really interesting for me to talk to her. And then the other one was Bernice Mene, who has just always been my idol. She was the one Silver Fern that I sort of grew up watching and thought, I want to be like her. I just loved the way she played, loved the way she carried herself on court, loved the way she spoke to the public, to the media. I just loved everything about her. So when I got to interview her, and she was just amazing.
And talking about Bernice, we used to get her in Australia here when the ANZ Championship was on. watching the Kiwi games. She's actually a very forthright commentator too. She does an excellent job for Sky.
Oh, she is. She's brilliant.
She's very good.
Yes, she is. She's excellent.
And just a more specific follow-up, because we know that netball has gained a lot of professionalism over the last decade or so in terms of the money that's been injected. But what else could you take away from those interviews in terms of how do we put this, people that played in past decades compared to who are being played now? Were there any other takeaways that came out?
In terms of getting paid for their salary and that sort of thing?
Beyond that, the levels of professionalism, but was there anything else apart from the obvious in terms of levels of professionalism or values of culture? Are there constants or do things change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, what was really exciting is that we analysed 60 years of the Silver Ferns, and we had quite a lot of the same themes come through. So, for example, wearing the black dress, the pride in wearing the black dress was consistent right from the beginning, right up until now. So that's been an absolute constant. The pride in being a Silver Fern, something that they really do, again, pride themselves on, is what their work ethic. Strong work ethic, just a positive vibe, positive culture. So these are the sort of things that just sort of span the 60 years. It didn't really change. What sort of did change over those 60 years were things like how the game advanced. It's become more physical, more faster, so players are going to be fitter, faster, stronger. In terms of what we talked about before with all the specialist areas, you've got your sports psychologists and strength and conditioning coaches and nutritionists and physio. So the game has also changed a lot, as again, like you talked about before, media, sponsorship, revenue, the salary the players are getting paid. Back in the day, they didn't get paid at all. It was purely just for the love of it. And there still is the love of the game now, but those top players are actually able to make a bit more of a living from being a Silver Fern. Generally, most players will have some sort of, second career as such, but those top players can earn a decent living off it now. So there's quite a few differences, but then also quite a few constants throughout the 60 years.
I would have thought one main difference, Dr. Lana, is the non-existence almost of a bit of a player pathway. Luke and I have spoken about this a lot because it hasn't always been very clear in New Zealand, whereas here in Australia, it's been a little bit more clearly defined. Is that right?
Yes.
Over there?
Yeah. And that was one thing that really came up as well. For a little country of New Zealand, 4 or 5 million, we do really, really well. We compete against Australia and generally match them most times. But that was one thing that the coaches brought up, was that there is a lack of a pathway. We do have a smaller player pool to choose from, whereas the Australians, they've got a really good sort of development pathway right from grassroots all the way up, and obviously they've got a larger number of players to choose from. But sometimes in some eras, New Zealanders have had to choose from a very limited pool of players, which has had an impact on the strength of the team, the performance. You're not always necessarily having the strongest players there, and feeding through as well. That's probably an issue that we've currently got as well. Our senior players, those ones who've been there for a while, when they retire, we need to do a bit more work at that development pathway level to feed those players up.
And just a little light-hearted question, but which Suncorp League team do you support?
Oh, well, I sort of go between the New South Wales Swifts and the Sunshine Coast Lightning. I know, different states, but I like players in both teams, and I like the coaches. And obviously, Nolene Todua was the coach of the Sunshine Coast Lightning before she came over to New Zealand. So I kind of like both of them.
You talk about Nolene Todua, Dr. Lana. Did you interview her for the book? Because Luke and I have had her on our show before, and I've interviewed her myself a couple of times. And she's often viewed as being a quirky character, but she's not. I'd call her an innovator. She's very passionate, but also very switched on and very ahead of the game. I vividly remember the Kiwi media made fun of her dressing up in a bee outfit and going to training, for example. But there's always a reason. There's always a reason behind what she does, isn't there?
Oh yeah. Look, I mean, I haven't actually had the pleasure of interviewing her. The research that I only went up to 2015. But yeah, look, I'm a big fan of Nolene. I think what she's done with the Sunshine Coast and then what she's learnt over here and then brought it back to New Zealand and what she's done with the Ferns, especially since, you know, we had the big debacle around the Commonwealth Games, just the massive change that she has done in such a short amount of time. She deserves, you know, a lot of credit. So yeah, she's brilliant. I think she's a fantastic coach.
Yeah, and is there any takeaways or anything that we have picked up on that you would like to mention? Because I think, you know, from such extensive research, I think it would be easy for us to miss any points that aren't obvious to us, even though we're netball fans.
I guess, you know, when it comes to team culture, it's very unique to each team. So the team culture of a netball team will probably differ to a team culture of a rugby team, of a hockey team, but it's what those players and the coaches and the management and the organisation all make of that. So it's something that, and one thing that I really learned was that you can't change or create a team culture within sort of 1 year, one season. It's a process. And each culture is unique. It's developed on, you know, each team's specific goals, their values, their rituals, you know, what sort of leadership styles and approaches are evident within the team, what sort of coaching approaches are used. So it's all specific, it's all unique. And it can also change from year to year as players change, as coaches change, as managers change. So it's always an evolving process. You can try one thing, may not work, but it might work the next year. So it's just something that you've got to constantly keep working at to develop. But if you put the time and the effort into developing your culture, developing effective leadership styles and approaches and coaching styles and approaches, it really does have an impact, a successful impact on the performance of your team.
And just back on the pathway thing, Dr. Lana, what are your thoughts on the ANZ Championship no longer existing? You've got ANZ Premiership now, and we've got Suncorp here. I personally think it was a bit of a travesty because I used to love being able to see the Silver Ferns players and other Kiwi players coming through rather than just when we play against the Silver Ferns in international netball. Yeah,
look, I mean, I definitely miss the whole Trans-Tasman clash with that. I can see both sides of it. I can see how New Zealand want to have their own in terms of growing their own pool of players and giving more opportunity for those younger players to play at that level. On the other hand, though, I think in some ways it can be a bit detrimental because we're missing out on that really strong competitive game against the Australians, learning their style because their styles are completely different. So I do feel that sometimes we are, when we do hit them in a Trans-Tasman test, that we haven't really had enough game time against them already. So I can sort of see both sides. I mean, I definitely miss the clashes and I would love to sort of see them get back together, but I can also see the reason why Australia wanted their own. I mean, there was only maybe one or two New Zealand teams who were really giving them a proper run. The rest were quite weak. So I can understand that some Australian teams weren't really getting what they wanted from the New Zealand teams. So I'm a bit half and half.
Oh, I understand your point. If I speak as a netball fan, which I try not to do purely on this show, there's elements of the old ANZ Championship I miss. I miss seeing some of the Australian players in the teams. But if I wear a more rational hat, I understand that Australia and New Zealand had different aims that weren't going to be compatible, so they had a no-fault divorce at the end of that competition. So I hear you entirely on that, but
yeah.
just getting away and putting on a more analytical hat. You mentioned the Mystics earlier, and I think it's reasonable to say, for having too harsh, the Mystics have a bit of a reputation in New Zealand having underperformed over the years. So what did you take away from your research and the work you did with that team?
Yeah, see, that was really interesting. And that was, like I said before, my very first introduction to team culture. And they realised that too. So at the time when I was doing some work with them, they actually had 7 current silver ferns in that Mystics team. So they should have been one of the best performing teams if they had 7 of the top players in one team. But actually, they were actually at the bottom. So, you know, there was something wrong. And what we found was that there was quite a bit of a gap between some players and the rest of the team. And the whole team wasn't really on the same page about what they wanted to achieve. There was also some issues around their leadership. You know, what styles of leadership, who was the captain, but there may have been others who felt that they could have been a better captain. So the leadership wasn't sort of cohesive as well. So there was quite a few little, just a disjointed approach in terms of their team culture, which can be fixed. But yeah, so that was probably one of the larger things that came out of that.
You talk about the team culture, and it should be reflected in what they've got on court in terms of having good players and things like that. You also look then also at the lower end of the scale back in the ANZ Championship days. You look at the tactics, for example, over here in Australia, they were the laughing stock, and it was really unfortunate to see that. And then the Pulse, they weren't very competitive for a long time, and then towards the end of the ANZ Championship, they ended up being pretty competitive. That sort of the lack of gap of competition. Do you feel that's one of the reasons why both academically yourself and also as a netball fan, why they separated from the ANZ and then went to the ANZ Premiership?
Yes, I think so. But I think in terms of the Central Pulse, they have again spent a lot of time on the bottom of the table. They have just sort of slowly worked again over the years at creating their team culture. I think what Yvette is doing in there at the moment is she's done a brilliant job. She is a really passionate coach again, very much around creating team culture. I think they've got some really good leadership roles in there. They've got Katrina Rori and they've got Amelia Ann. So they've got some really good senior leader players who, you know, have been around for a while. Know what to set those examples, set the tone for those younger players to come through. And I think that's something that has been developed over the years. In terms of the tactics, I think, it's really hard when you're constantly losing, to really try and get yourself out of that. So they've got a constant battle on their hands. They win the odd game, but they need to be much more consistent. And we've found that having a core group of players that are sort of there year after year after year, eventually over time, a team does improve. But if they're sort of losing players and losing their senior players and switching in and out sort of thing, it does have an impact on their team and their success. And that's largely the reason why they're struggling at the moment. They've had changes in coaching as well, which also takes time to get used to. So a bit of change there, which probably hasn't helped with their team culture growth.
I just want to point out for the tactics supporters and any members of the tactic that are watching this is reference to the times when the tactics were struggling. They have improved a vast amount, but the problem is their improvement is not covered in the time period of your book. So I just want to clarify that out of fairness to the tactic, because I myself have been very harsh on that team in the past, because once upon a time when I lived in the Greater Christchurch area, I attended their games. So, but then just if you're speaking of player turnover, and I won't go over the tactic again because I think you've nailed it, although I have commented to Ben in the past on the player turnover. What then do you make of the success of the Sunshine Coast Lightning? They won like the first 2 Suncourt League grand finals. I mean, they had no team culture. They didn't exist in the years before that.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be honest, I probably can't comment too much on the Sunshine Coast Lightning. I didn't really know too much around their development and stuff, but obviously, I think, Nolene, what her knowledge, her background, her passion in terms of creating a team culture, I think she's had such a significant role in that. I think she obviously decided on who she wanted beforehand in terms of the right players to make that team. Someone, for example, like Laura Langman, she followed her from New Zealand, followed her over to Australia to play for her. So she's obviously got this pull over players that I want to go play for Nolene because of the way she coaches and her approaches and just her style and her manner with players. So I think that probably has a large part to do with just establishing that culture, because it does come from the coach largely, and from management. And then if you've got some senior players on board, everybody else follows. So that, you know, I mean, again, can't really comment too much, but potentially that might have had a bit of an impact on it.
And just the last one from me, Dr. Lana, it's a bit of a light-hearted one. How do you go as a Silver Ferns supporter in Australia, and have you copped any light-hearted ribbing from any Aussies, whether fellow academics at your work or just out on the street, when they hear your accent?
Oh yes, I get teased a lot about my accent, and yeah, and it's just good old-fashioned Kiwi Aussie banter, isn't it? Really. But I just have to keep reminding them, you know, who are the current world champs? Well, New Zealand. So
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for joining us today, Dr. Lana. It's been really great. We've covered a lot of topics, both with the book Will to Win and outside of the book. And netball fans, go and buy a copy of the book.
thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.